Good evening. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Paul Alivisatos, President of the University of Chicago. Our evening's theme is of deep importance to all of us. There are moments throughout history when political and social conflicts on global, national, and local scales are acute. In such times, dialogue across difference is challenging, yet also all the more important. This is such a moment. The challenge of such situations is acute, especially in universities, where our essential mission of understanding, discovery, and truth-seeking depends on our ability to question each other, to listen, to be willing to share our own views respectfully. Such intense moments are ones when we do well to reflect on our principles and to interrogate our practice. To anyone who has come into contact with the University of Chicago, you will know that free expression is the first principle of the university, much as freedom of speech is the First Amendment of the Constitution that underpins our democracy. The practice of free inquiry and free expression are the common currency of what it means to be a UChicago citizen. There are, of course, other principles that are in conversation with and vital in support of free expression. They include our commitment to excellence in the pursuit of knowledge, a recognition that diversity of viewpoint and experience promotes healthy questioning of received wisdom, and finally, a fierce resistance to any authority seeking to establish truths or limit discussion, whether such forces be internal or external, governments or mobs, wealth or power. Those principles play an important role in bolstering our ability to sponsor a genuine environment of free expression. The task of maintaining the conditions for free and open expression is anything but easy. On our campus, it starts with an invitation to first embrace the Chicago principles and then extends to our commitment to their ongoing practice. The results of our long-term and systematic commitment to free expression over our institution's history are evident, from field-defining discoveries to worldwide recognition of what our community has offered to the theory and practice of free expression. We must remember that we will never be in a finished or realized state. Like all truth-seeking, free expression itself is a constant struggle. What does it mean to practice that commitment on a day-to-day basis? How are we really doing? We live in an era marked by intense polarization, and threats to free expression have emerged from multiple corners. But these challenges are not new. In any given era, efforts to dictate which ideas can be engaged and which may not are as prevalent as ever-shifting political tides of society. We believe it is not the obligation of our university to serve the dominant ideas of the day, but rather to forge more robust ideas. It's vital then that we ask ourselves, are we being shaped by our environment, or are we shaping it? As president, I have seen firsthand the real depth of commitment to free expression in our university. Yet it is essential that we undertake again and again the difficult work of interrogating our practice on our campuses and renewing our commitment. This evening, we will hear from individuals who play key roles as administrators or thought leaders in the practice and culture of free expression at this university. Together, they will take us on a journey in which we remind ourselves of the principles and we examine the integrity of our practice. This gathering is sponsored by our newly established Chicago Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression, which was formed to serve as a further venue for our living commitment to free and open discourse. This program is the first of a series of planned conversations on many aspects of free expression and the controversies of this time and moment. I really hope that you will join us for all of the conversations in the coming months. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Jason Merchant, the Lorna Strauss Distinguished Professor of Linguistics and a Vice Provost of this university. Jason.
Thank you, President Alivisatos. It is my great pleasure to moderate tonight's discussion of 4 distinguished and experienced panelists who have dealt with the issues of free expression, free inquiry at the university for many years. So without further ado, I'd like to start with the panelist on my left. We have Professor Kenneth Warren, who is the Fairfax M. Cone Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of English, and who served on the committee that drafted and wrote the report that was issued on free expression, which later came to be known as the Chicago Principles. So, Ken, I would like to hear a little bit about your experiences on that committee, the thinking that went into the drafting of those principles that are so well known now, and your experiences afterwards, what you've seen on campus and beyond as those principles have been implemented.
Okay, thank you, Jason. And I do agree that it would be useful to talk a little bit about the history of the committee to give something of a historical narration for the purpose of our discussion. From the standpoint of my role as a member of the Committee on Freedom of Expression, the committee was chaired by Jeff Stone, I think as many know, and it was convened in the summer of 2014 with a charge to deliver its report by the first day of the next calendar year. And just quickly, the other members of the committee were Mary Ann Bertrand from the Booth School of Business, Angelo Olinto from the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics, Mark Siegler from Medicine and Surgery, David Strauss from the Law School, and Amanda Woodward from the Department of Psychology and the college. And let me say at the outset that I shouldn't be taken here as speaking for the committee. I mean, I think the report itself does that, but rather in my capacity as a privileged participant in the process. And I actually hope that some of the committee members might actually be in the audience and might offer their reflections in the questions. The committee's charge, which was given by our late President Bob Zimmer and then Provost Eric Isaacs, asserted their conclusion that the university would benefit from having a statement that was analogous to the Calvin Report that articulated the university's overarching commitment to free, robust, and uninhibited debate and deliberation among all the members of the university community. And upon convening as a committee, we read through materials pertaining to the freedom of expression at the University of Chicago and at other institutions of higher learning that had faced challenges around speech and protest. The University of Chicago had not had a series of horrible events around this. There had been a couple of things, but the president felt that given the climate of the moment where these issues were being raised, it would be a good opportunity or it would be good for the university to address these. And so our task, as I understood it, was to be both sort of descriptive and prescriptive. That is, on the descriptive side, we weren't developing principles like from the ground up, but rather we were deriving from the history of university actors since its founding, the ideas and presumptions that had guided them as they, by precept and example, had sought to articulate and enact the principles they felt had best served the university. But we were also being prescriptive, I think, in seeking to craft a statement that allowed for the widest latitude for the expression of ideas and beliefs that were consistent with the mission of the institution to support freedom of inquiry, robust discussion, and the open access of all members of our community to the discursive community. And so we met with a variety of members of the community, students, our faculty colleagues, and staff members, and particularly those administrators who were most closely involved in student life. And for me, the meetings with this last group were particularly important because although I had been happy to accept the appointment to the committee, I had done so with some initial skepticism about the advisability of having an official statement. Because my concern was that official documents of this sort might have an effect opposite to their intent, enabling action against individuals or groups by labeling them as enemies of freedom of expression. If they were to question aspects of the document or the implementation of the document. But it was actually in talking to members of our administrative staff who were, so to speak, on the front lines that I was persuaded that having a statement of principles pertaining to freedom of expression would be beneficial for not only our administrators, but for our students. And so the statement, as it came out, is, it's not perfect. No statement is. It doesn't, for example, really lay out the relationship between freedom of expression and, say, academic freedom or freedom of inquiry. And it was also by design limited in certain ways. So, for example, it didn't specify what actions, if any, the university might take if it were determined that individuals or groups had acted in ways that were contrary to the spirit in the letter of the report. And for that, the subsequent committee that you'll hear about, the Committee on University Discipline for Disruptive Conduct, was later convened to issue a report setting out the guidelines. And another feature of the report's rollout that's worth keeping in mind, and I do think the current forum addresses this, is that due to the role of the Foundation for Individual Rights, an organization called FIRE, in response to the statements being issued, we presented it to the president. It was presented to the council of the university senate, and then promulgated without sort of further discussion. And FIRE took it up, and they took it up as, they described it as the gold standard for campus commitments to freedom of expression. And they began championing it nationwide. So it had a national and international profile as the thing to do that actually kind of outstripped its rollout on campus to a certain extent. And one effect of this was that the effectiveness of the statement, the efficacy of it, was being championed before we had actually sort of seen it in action here on campus. And so, I guess I'll conclude by saying one of the significant features of my involvement as someone who had been, there at the beginning of this process was seeing a conversation kind of have to catch up to the status of the document internally, and to bring the members of the university community into a discussion about this document, to see it as something that was not simply written in stone, but something written by stone, so to speak, but something that was, still flexible and in need of further elaboration and further discussion.
Great, thanks, Ken. Before we turn it to the next, I want to remind our audience that we will have a question and answer period at the end in about an hour. So that will be moderated by our colleague Tom Ginsberg. But you can start putting your questions in now. You don't have to wait until we're done talking. So thanks. I'd like to turn now to my colleague, Daniel Ababa, who is the Harold and Marion Green Professor in the law school and Vice Provost in the university. Part of your job is overseeing policy for and implementation across the university for a number of policies and guidelines that have been developed, including the Chicago Principles, but also a few other core reports across the years, including the Calvin Report. So I'd love to invite you to tell us a little bit about that and how those reports fit together into the framework that we see every day on campus.
Great. Thank you. And it's a real privilege to have a chance to discuss these important issues with this great panel. So we can think about our free speech environment, or the environment for free expression, as having a bit of an architecture. And that architecture is built around 3 reports that were put together between 2014 and 2017, and then, of course, the Calvin Report of 1967. So let me say a little bit about each of them and how they work together, and then focus a bit on the Calvin Report. So in 2014, the report on the Ad hoc Committee on Protest and Dissent articulated the university's values with respect to protest and dissent, how it's critical to the educational environment in which we produce students and other citizens in democracy who are capable of expressing their views and engaging in protest. And it was emphasized that the kind of passionate expression of non-conforming ideas is actually central to the education that we want to provide. And an environment that merely tolerated protest and dissent was insufficient. Rather, we should be one that embraces it, and that would be a concern if we didn't have it. That then led to the next report that Ken described, and Ken described it very well. But you can imagine the responsibilities that attach to that. We do have an environment that encourages protest and dissent. In order to have that protest and dissent, we need to have the widest diversity of viewpoints and ideas being able to be expressed. And the 2015 report that Ken described absolutely provides that kind of wide latitude for individuals in the university community to express their views and their ideas. But as Ken also pointed out, there wasn't an infrastructure to help navigate, now that we have these responsibilities and opportunities that have existed, long-standing at the university. What do we do when these are challenged or imperiled? And so part of the work that I was part of in the Committee on University Disruptive Conduct, along with Michelle, was to think through what is a structure to make sure that we can live these values from day to day. One that encourages protest and dissent, and provides education so people understand our values, but also ensures that speakers who come here are not deplatformed, have the opportunity to express their views, and that the recipients, the audience, those of us who want to engage in conversation, have the ability to do that in a way that's not imperiled. And that was the charge that we had. Now, those 3 reports really capture what's been going on in the longer history of the university. But maybe the key part about the university's responsibility goes to the Calvin Report. And I'll say a little bit more about that. So the Calvin Report stands for the proposition, as it's generally understood, that there's a heavy presumption against the university engaging in speech on political and social action, unless it threatens the very mission of the university or its values of free inquiry. So what does all that mean? And the document is fantastic and rich, and I encourage everyone who's listening to engage with it. But it first defines what the mission of the university is. And that mission is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. And it says that endeavor at a university is one that naturally should be challenging of existing social arrangements. It should question social values and institutions. And it should be upsetting. It should bring up questions. It should engage in critique. But it focuses on the fact that, indeed, the instrument of that dissent and criticism is the individual faculty member and the individual student. So the university is indeed the host and sponsor of critics, but it's not itself the critic. And this is critical in order to encourage the widest range of viewpoints to be expressed and to not place a burden on anyone who endeavors to speak in a way that might be inconsistent with what they think the university might feel. And this has been described in the context of institutional neutrality. And it's not a neutrality out of indifference, as the authors describe it. Rather, it's one that creates the enabling conditions for all of us, faculty and students, to be able to speak without concern about the university restricting us or otherwise signaling which ideas are worthy of discussion and which ones are not. Now, of course, for those who very much like the Calvin Report has nuance and it has some subtlety. And it recognizes that there will be moments when the university does need to speak. And in fact, when it talks about the instances in society that threaten the very mission of the university or its values of free inquiry, it doesn't say that the university should speak. It actually says it has an obligation to speak. It doesn't envision those moments happening every day, but it does have that affirmative responsibility for the university. What's also, I think, important about the Calvin Report is that the authors themselves in the report actually embraces a level of humility. And the humility is in the fact that it recognizes that these principles are large principles and important principles, but it says the application of these principles to individual cases is not always going to be easy. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that whatever the value of Calvin, and I think there's enormous value to it, the authors were thoughtful that it doesn't capture every question, it doesn't purport to answer every question, and that there's work for all of us to do to think about what are the sort of questions that are worthy of the university engaging in, which are those that are not, and that we're in constant dialogue in having an active construction of the document over time. So that, I think, is critical. And if you think of these 4 documents together, some of them articulate principles and values, others a policy, but they give us, I think, an architecture for thinking about free expression at the university.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. Michelle Rasmussen is the Dean of Students in the university, and she oversees campus and student life, which has responsibility for supporting students in all of their endeavors on campus. So, Michelle, you were also on the committee that drafted the report on disruptive conduct. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you see in the student world on where students are encouraged by the university to pursue academic interests in free inquiry and express themselves, but there are also limits that are imposed by the necessity of running a university.
That's right. And I think one of the great contributions of all of the reports that have been noted so far is that they do provide the scaffolding by which student life professionals like myself can then take them out to students and help them understand how they translate to their actual lived experience on campus. So I see an important part of my role is translating in some way these aspirations, visions, values of the university as they're included in these reports and translate them in a way that students can actually understand what the rules of engagement are. And one of the things that we learned in our work on the University Committee for Disruptive Conduct was that many of our most active student groups and student individuals really, really wanted to know, what are the bright white lines? What can I cross? What can I cross? And what are the consequences for us if we cross that line? So that they can decide on what level of protest, dissent, activism, whatever the activity might be, is what it's going to result in. And so we've worked very hard not only on the discipline piece of it and outlining the policy and process and procedures so students fully understand what their rights and privileges are within that system, but very importantly, we've really worked hard on the education piece. So making sure that with our student groups that might be recognized or even not recognized, that if they want advice or information on how they can, for example, have a protest and have it not run afoul of university policy, we have a very, very sophisticated, I think, and elaborate system of advising to help those students understand what they can and cannot do. We want to make sure, too, that during protest and demonstration activity that we have staff on site who are there specifically to provide information to students in the moment of protests and demonstration so that they can be a source of information not only on policy, but on how the event can go well. Getting back to an earlier point, we're not opposed to protest and demonstration. It's a very important part of the intellectual life of this institution. So we're not here just to tolerate it here. We're here to support it and actively promote it. And you need to make sure that you have the trained staff in place to not only help students navigate policies and procedures, but also how they can actually partake of this type of freedom of expression. So it's been really important challenge for us. We don't always get it right. We have a certain degree of humility as well. We try to learn from every experience and engagement we have with students, whether it be student protesters or a student group that's concerned about a particular issue, and make sure that we're constantly trying to improve and refine how we work with students so that they can feel that they really are part of this intellectual community.
Great, thanks. Well, you mentioned education, and that brings us to our last panelist, Gabriel Richardson-Lear, who is professor in the departments of philosophy and the Committee on Social Thought, which she is also currently chairing, and who delivered the Aims of Education address in 2018 to our incoming students in the college. So Gabriel, in that address, you mentioned free inquiry, the sort that inspires wonder and is oriented by wonder, is a joint activity and a form of intellectual friendship. I wonder if you could say a few words about how free inquiry and free expression intersect with the ideas that you talked about then.
Yes, I would love to talk about that, and this has been really interesting already. Thank you all. So just to back up a second, because I teach philosophy, so I'm always going back to first principles. I mean, the university is here to discover new knowledge. And knowledge is a living activity, and that it's not a set of propositions that are true, but it's when you have knowledge, you understand why the things that are true, your evidence or your arguments in favor of them. But also more fundamentally, I want to say that real understanding is an answer to a question. It's not just a collection of true statements, but it's an answer to a question that we have. And so, in a way, more prior to the discovery of new knowledge or new answers to questions, we've got to be able to question. So that, to me, when I think about free inquiry in the university and freedom of expression, really the most important thing is, do we have an atmosphere of free questioning? And how do we create an environment that encourages questioning and the kind of questioning that's fruitful? So one thing that I said in that Aims of Education address is that, yes, it's true that we question in the sense of critique, but I'd like to say that that's actually a later moment in the process of inquiry. That comes after you already have a sense of what you think. Before that, you have to do the kind of questioning where you really don't know yet what you think. There's something that isn't adding up. So I think that if we frame our goal as, are we a place that facilitates the kind of questioning and trying out answers and seeking answers, if that's our goal, then it has ramifications for what we think this freedom is that we care so much about. We talk about freedom of expression, but to me that often sounds like we're presuming that people already know what they think, and the question is just what are the impediments to their expressing it. And that's really important. We need that, but I think it's this other kind of freedom, the spaces where people feel that they can question and have a kind of freedom of mind to play and try out answers. So, one place that this comes up, if we think about, we want not only sort of institutions and practices that foster this kind of activity, but also what are the habits of mind that we want our students and our faculty to develop so that they can engage in this kind of conversation. And here we like to talk about parrhesia, and that is, originally that was sort of the ancient Greek virtue of having the courage to speak your mind to somebody more powerful. But what Socrates did was this radical inversion of what parrhesia meant, so that it's not now the courage to say what you already think you know, but the courage to admit that you don't know. I would like us to, how do we develop that courage to admit, which is sometimes scary, particularly when what it is that you might not know can come across as offensive to others in the very fact that you think that you don't yet know the answer to this question. So that's, one way I think of it. I also think, what does this conversation look like when it's going well? We should think more about that. It could be a sort of, ideally it would be harmonious, cooperative, a friendly conversation in which we are challenging each other and seeking answers. But when the topics that you're talking about, the closer they get to existential issues or morally relevant issues, the more likely it is that that conversation is going to be fraught, and it's going to be, unpleasant and difficult. And so one threat to the freedom of conversation is, obstacles to people saying what they think. But another threat is people wondering, who needs this? Why is it that I should engage in this conversation when people are raising questions that I find offensive, that they're even asking, or trying out answers that I find offensive, or that I'm in a position of trying to explain myself to people who just won't get it? Why is this an important kind of activity to engage in? I think we should be doing more thinking about that, and there will be different answers. It's I think it's important to democracy and also to our own happiness, but we need to think. We need to think about that. So, so that's the kind of thing I was talking about in that address.
Great. So we're at the University of Chicago. All of us on this panel, I think, believe deeply in the value of the Chicago principles and in the Calvin report. But it would be a very dull panel if we all just agreed with each other and gave pronouncements. So I'd like to sort of talk about some of the harder cases, right, where things sort of come apart. And all of you have mentioned things that are worth exploring. I'd like to come back to something a distinction Ken made between academic freedom and free expression. Often these two things get conflated, but at a university, we think of academic freedom as central to our mission, teaching and learning. Freedom of expression is a term that's used widely outside of the university as well, and applies to a lot of kinds of things, speech and protests that some may find offensive, but are also valuable within the university. So I wondered if anyone, I don't want to put Ken on the spot, but obviously you made this very crucial distinction. I think we see it in the name of the forum, for free inquiry and expression. Could you maybe unpack those two a little bit for us?
And I certainly would appreciate help from my colleagues as I do so, because with respect to freedom of expression, if you think of it in the context of First Amendment rights, it's very, very wide. It's indiscriminate in some sense. People can say a whole lot of things, and by virtue of simply having an opinion, you have something like the right to express it. Academic freedom, while it involves freedom of inquiry, it's inquiry that takes place, in a community of scholars who have principles for inquiry, deciding on the worth or the soundness of the kind of scholarship that's being produced. And so academic freedom actually requires the sort of institutional underwriting of the capacity to make discriminations, to make judgments, to declare certain things to be invalid or untrue, to say that certain things have been established and should be treated as such until one has reason not to do so. And so there is a kind of production of boundaries that it seems to be necessary if we're going to have academic freedom. The idea that a community of scholars, again, independent of external influence and all of the things that, many of the things that President Alivisatos mentioned in his opening remarks, cannot come into play because it is a duly constituted group of scholars that have the right to determine, not by virtue of just because they're just great, but because they have done the work. That work has been examined and vetted, and that one can make determinations as to the validity and the invalidity of certain claims, certain lines of inquiry. And those are the kinds of distinctions that, when we think about academic freedom, need to be supported. It's precisely the capacity of duly constituted groups of scholars to make determinations about what is going to be what is important and what isn't important. That's not fixed.
Right.
It can change over time, but the principle there is somewhat different, I think, than the broader principles of freedom of expression.
Right. So it sounds like you're talking about acknowledging the fact that we are deeply invested in the development of expertise, and that expertise does set boundaries to inquiry in some ways because it provides a framework for deeply knowledgeable individuals about topics to reach conclusions on them. When those conclusions are in conflict with either with students' ideas or with the outer world's ideas, right, then it's the university's obligation to support scholars in the expression of those ideas and the promulgation of those ideas. And I think, Michelle, you mentioned part of our duty is to educate students in how they can go about this. So you oversee our student organizations, right? Students interact with the university in lots of different ways, in the classroom with scholars, but also through their own activities in registered student organizations. And registered student organizations have the right to invite outside speakers to the university who may be experts in a domain of knowledge, but may not be. That's their right. So what kind of guidance do we give students in thinking about exercising that right responsibly, educating them on what it is the universities do and what kind of events we are happy to sponsor?
Well, I think, it's important to note that our students are actually incredibly sophisticated in terms of self-governance, and that extends to their registered student organizations, and we do provide advising, but it tends to be more about logistical, mechanical things about running an organization and far less about content and how should you be thinking about what you're doing as a group. We like to have a fairly hands-off approach to that. And you're absolutely right. We give student organizations, whether they're recognized or not, they have every right to invite speakers to campus by virtue of the fact that they're members of the campus community, and they can do that. What we want to try to make sure they understand is that in order for the event to be successful, it would be wise for them to take into account a whole variety of important questions. So, if they invite somebody who is likely, for whatever reason, to be particularly controversial or perhaps to share a point of view that we should anticipate other members of the community are not going to like, or they're going to find disagreeable or even intolerable, how can we design that event to make sure that it meets that student group's goals and doesn't end up being what I would call unsuccessful because either the speaker is shouted down or there are excessive security concerns or there's, just an overall climate of wanting to deplatform that person. I mean, that's not consistent with our values around free expression and letting people share their ideas and have those ideas be contested. So where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, is in helping those groups and those students think about what they're trying to ultimately achieve with that event and make sure that all of the preparations, logistics, and planning are consistent with it being successful. Very often when you look at other institutions where things go sideways with invited speakers, oftentimes it's because the kind of planning and preparation that went around it and communication that went around it perhaps wasn't as well executed as it could have been. And so that's something that we really work on with students.
You mentioned that we're hands-off. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know the process by which outside speakers get invited to speak on campus. There's many, many different venues. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what kind of review, if any at all, your office provides for students. And then I'd like to ask Gabriel to stress the same thing on the faculty side.
So we don't have any kind of committee or administrator who reviews student proposals and calls students in to discuss why you're bringing this speaker in, or that just doesn't exist, and there's no committee that I'm aware of on campus that does that for any speaker. In fact, the only kind of oversight is really just to review the events that are coming in, see what spaces are being reserved, and really it's again just to make sure that the events are successful. So, we might have a conversation with a student group about, gee, if you're having this person come, maybe this room would be a better choice than this room because it's going to have more capacity, or we can make sure that we have dean on call staffing more appropriately staffed if we think it's going to be controversial. There's a better zone for protesters if there's going to be protest. It's more about how can we make this successful than any kind of, you really might want to think about not having this person because it's going to create controversy or upset.
Yeah, so you're asking about the faculty inviting speakers to come to departments.
Or departments inviting them.
I can't imagine a dean reviewing our decision, and that wouldn't happen. The faculty, there are committees, or sometimes a particular person is tasked with deciding who the speakers for a department will be in a given year or quarter, and I think that everybody's goal is to have somebody come who we think might actually have something interesting to teach us. And that's why it's so important to make sure that there is a space in which they can actually say what it is that they might teach us, and that we could or that they want to say to us, and we can ask and sometimes challenge them, and we need to have that conversation. But can I go back to something that Ken brought up about the academic freedom, and you framed that as an issue of expertise, Jason. And I think that's right. We are developing expertise, but I also think it's just that there is a responsibility that teachers have in classrooms about what's the orientation of a line of questioning going to be? What are the terms of the debate going to be? And likewise, the tenured faculty have the responsibility to decide, these are the people that we want to recommend to be hired or to be promoted. And when we're doing that, it's true that we are saying, that line of questioning and research looks interesting to us. And sometimes we're saying, no, this is another line of questioning. And what our expertise is not always about knowing, but having, as Ken said, done the work of thinking about how you ask questions and how you go about answering them so that we can make these judgments. But I think, that is a big responsibility. It's academic authority. And I wonder how comfortable all of our colleagues are in thinking about the fact that we do have that authority, and it's not just power. How do we distinguish it between power and authority? And how that fits into the freedom of expression of our students and our instructional professors who are not on a tenure track. So there's a lot to be thought about there.
Yeah, I just want to come back. I think sometimes people outside of academia don't understand that there is no prior review for the invitations of speakers. A professor is generally free to invite anyone to their classroom, exactly as you said, Gabriel, if that person has something to teach us, right? If I believe that someone speaking to my students would be informative, I can do that. The university supports that. And likewise for student groups, likewise for departments, for colloquia, for seminars. Not only is there no prior review, there's often no post hoc review either, right? We often find out that someone's been invited to speak only at the event, at the occasion, which is to say the university, the deans don't get lists of all the people who are speaking that week and sort of know what's happening in their units. That's just not the way the university works. Faculty and students have enormous autonomy to decide what questions they're going to pursue and within the boundaries, like you said, that are set. One of the obligations we have under the Calvin report, Daniel, you mentioned, is the promotion of diversity of viewpoints. It's a phrase that comes from the Calvin report. Diversity of viewpoints is mentioned twice, I think. Could you say a little bit more about how that works?
Yes. So since just some context on the work. Since the fall of 2020, I, along with you and others, have worked a lot to provide, I think, workshops and education about the Calvin report itself, the values that it purports to share, how those lived values frame how the university engages with respect to political and social action. And in doing so, I've had the opportunity to have a lot of conversations with a lot of people, deans, chairs, members of staff, students, et cetera. And there may be three areas that come up quite a bit when people are asking questions about how Calvin works and looking for guidance and understanding the nuances. And maybe the prominent three first are the question about what's the mission of the university. So the Calvin report talks about the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge, but also we engage in the delivery of excellent clinical care in the hospital. That's part of the university's mission. And the question then becomes, over time, as the university grows, as it has different responsibilities and takes on different obligations within a broader community and defines its role differently, does that then change the mission of the institution such that the sort of issues that threaten the very mission of the university become broader than perhaps the limited ambition of the Calvin report, which is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge? That naturally would create a broader space, arguably, for the university to speak if indeed the mission is interpreted more broadly. Maybe the second area that comes up is the Calvin report is great for some, but to whom is it addressed? Who does it guide? And we live in a moment now where, at least when the authors were thinking about the Calvin Report, there weren't that many venues for communication. There weren't necessarily the full range of university subunits, whether it's centers and institutes, for example, and the various functional offices all have now the capacity to speak, whether it's through a web page or whether through their management of their own social media. So then the question is, well, gosh, it seems like it applies to the president and maybe the provost, and I get the deans. Does it apply to the chairs and heads of centers and institutes? And what is the criteria for making that evaluation? I think that's an important question that we have to struggle with. It's not one that suggests that the import of the Calvin Report itself or its principles don't apply generally, but how to work through them with respect to different people in different roles, I think, is particularly important. The third one goes to neutrality. And some would describe it maybe as institutional restraint, but neutrality, for many presupposes some set of existing social arrangements that somehow is the baseline against which we measure our activity or our active speaking. And in that way, some might say that it embraces a current set of distribution of resources, power, et cetera, that in of itself is a statement. And so these are not questions that the Calvin Report directly answers, but these are exactly the sort of things that when we think about the broader principles about the university's role in social, or speaking in political and social action, whether there should be a heavy presumption against it, how do we then work through these challenges in a way that is respectful to those who have a different view, but also, I think, drives us toward, hopefully, a common conception of what the university's role should be in this area. There are others, but I think those are the three core things that have come up in my 4 years working on these issues.
So Daniel mentioned chairs, and Gabriel has been chair of philosophy and is chair of social thought. And I wonder if you could just put on your chair's hat for a second and think through what kind of issues Calvin helps you with or hinders you.
I find it very helpful to have these discussions ahead of time about what the sort of guardrails are a little bit, and thinking about the kind of speech that I should give as chair and also the department. So it hasn't come up in the departments that I am a part of, but I know it does come up in other places, that there's sometimes a desire of faculty to post a statement on a departmental website. And this is tricky because whereas, if the president were to make a statement, there had not have been a democratic process or much less consensus about that statement. But in a department, it can be small enough so that there can be consensus. And sometimes people want to know, well, why can't we, given that there's consensus, why can't we post that statement? But I am a firm believer that there is a potential chilling effect for graduate students and future faculty, also instructional professors, not so much, even if they happen to agree with it, there's a sense of that the faculty have views and that there's a question, are you in line with the views or not in line with the views? And I do think that in the day-to-day life of our students and of faculty, it's this question of departmental authority and individual faculty authority is much more where people feel potential fear and constraint than at higher levels of administration where the president and the provost and the deans don't actually hear you speak, so they don't know what you've said. So that is one thing, but it can be tough. There are also cases where, graduate students will ask to have a petition circulated, and sometimes they're about issues that, your heart goes out. You get why they want to circulate those. But in my interpretation of Calvin, that again is not something I should forward as chair. But we have to admit this is a little tricky. It's always an ideal we're aiming towards because, just being if you're a dissertation committee chair, you're going to have authority over your graduate student. A teacher in a classroom, we're always speaking and we are in positions of power and authority, and So, we have to be careful, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't ever speak. So Calvin sort of gives us a way of saying, where are we going to draw the line about, I, as, a professor, I'm gonna express my views just as a human being. I'm going to express my views. But when I'm sort of formally speaking as chair, I am going to be a little bit more constrained.
So,
And because I think you raised a lot of very important issues, and as you may recall, the English department, of which I'm a member, in the summer of 2020, in the wake of the George Floyd protests, did indeed issue a statement from the department, a statement that was voted on unanimously by the department, and raised a lot of questions as to whether or not Calvin was violated in making that decision. And I think, there are strong arguments on either side. I did feel, in thinking about it, that procedurally it didn't violate Calvin because, Calvin points out that while that the university has no mechanism for reaching consensus, but as you've pointed out, departments do. They are able to do so, and we were able to do so. I'm not sure in the wake of that how comfortable I felt about the decision to actually issue the statement. I'm not a fan of, I don't believe strongly in the efficacy of those statements long term. They often are things, as this statement was, that are issued in the heat of the moment for reasons that feel good. Whether they are over the long haul the best way to respond to issues, I think that's up for question. But on that account, I don't think that. Calvin provides guidelines; it doesn't provide answers. I think
Right.
in that respect, that violate, or did it support Calvin? And the second thing I'll say before I shut up has to do with the point that you raised about authority, and then the diversity of viewpoints issue that Jason raised as well, right? Because the whole point of academic authority, in some sense, is to say not everything goes. And when you have a moment where I could say a public perception of the academy or of a particular institution is that certain views have been authorized and others have not been authorized, then people outside of the institution can say, well, wait a minute, what about?
Yeah.
It feels to me that these institutions are highly liberal. Where's conservative thought in the English department or in the philosophy department or something of that sort? And the tension there between the exercise of authority that says, well, actually, these are the views that we have found and deemed to be most productive at the moment. They don't include everything. Can actually then create the perception of just bias or an unwillingness to countenance viewpoints, not simply because they're not, there's no way that a certain kind of fairness or evenness of opinion can be brought to bear in the domain of, I shouldn't say no way, but there's a tension there. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in
And we
mind.
need to think about that. It's that's what I was saying, that in a way there's no line of question that's going to be fruitful that doesn't have some presuppositions and assumptions behind it. That's just necessary, because what a good question isn't like, well, what do you think about such and such? It's more, well, this seems right and that seems right, and yet things aren't adding up. And part of what we are having to judge is a fruitfulness of a line of questioning, and that does involve some presupposition. So how can we do that in a way that also is recognizing, expressing some humility? And I worry, because right now we're in a moment where the wider society just is losing confidence in our academic authority, and that is very dangerous for us. But I think it also requires, on our part, that we do some thinking about, well, how can we ensure that we are taking this responsibility seriously and communicating the way in which we do that? I think it's crucial.
I'd like to comment, provide an alternative perspective to Ken's initial comment, and the first point you made regarding the English department and the unanimous vote. And I think Calvin does provide us some guidance that might lead to a different conclusion than the one that you described. That is that there isn't really a mechanism to engage in collective action in a way that doesn't have a chilling effect on other members of the community. So you might imagine that in a department, even if there's a unanimous vote of faculty, there are postdocs, there are students, and there are others who, when they think about their dissertations they want to write, they think about the faculty with whom they want to work, they think about the opportunities questions they want to pursue. They understand not only is there a faculty that will vote and take a position on something, there's actually a litmus test, perhaps, per the faculty, that then shapes the sort of ideas that I think I want to bring forward as a student. And the consequences, I think, are even beyond, I use the internal environment, externally. Do we want to signal that we are a department when we're looking to hire wonderful, faculty at whatever level, or bring in excellent graduate students? That is the currency for entering the department is being willing to agree to this particular set of views, or being willing to be in a department where these views come up and are voted on, and that's the nature of the conversation. So it's not to say that Calvin, we completely agree that Calvin does not answer that question, but we can draw, I think, different inferences from Calvin and come in different directions. Thank you, Jason.
Great,
for your time.
great. So what you're saying is that there's no Calvin exception for unanimous votes?
I think that's that's one reading that's been provided, but we can have that conversation.
So there are lots of great issues that have been raised here. I think it's time now to invite my colleague, Tom Ginsberg, to the podium, who will be moderating our question and answer period. Tom is the Leo Spitz Professor in the Law School and the founding director of the University of Chicago Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks so much. I'm, as Jason said, Tom Ginsberg, and I wanted to just say a word about what is this forum. We have a three-part mission: understanding, practicing, and advancing free expression. And we're doing all kinds of things on campus. Please feel free to check out our website for our activities and stay in touch on it. We've gotten a lot of great questions over the chat, and so I want to start with a pair of questions about protest. Professor Ababa, you say that we encourage protest here at the University of Chicago. How exactly did the arrest and charge of students occupying Rosenwald Hall advance that? And then I want to pair that with a questioner who asked, why are we tolerating building occupations and class disruptions? Of course, protests should be allowed on the quad, but not elsewhere. So two opposed views. Maybe I may start with Michelle, actually, and then maybe turn to Daniel to see if he wants to supplement that.
So, paired with shouting down speakers or actively interfering with, say, a classroom lecture or activity, when we're talking about disruptive conduct, is also another set of behaviors. And those behaviors have to do with disruptions to university operations. And so while the occupation of a university building may seem like a peaceful, even benign way of protesting or showing, support for a particular cause, there may be consequences for the operations of the building and the offices and units within that building if people choose to occupy a building after it's supposed to be closed. That raises questions around who's going to make sure that those occupants are safe. People come to work in the morning and there's people, camped out in their lobby. How are they supposed to do their work, et cetera, et cetera. So when we have protests and demonstrations, as I mentioned before, we want to actively support students or any other member of the campus community's right to do that. But when it starts to cross over into interference with university operations, we need to advise those individuals in those groups that we need them to change what they're doing or stop what they're doing. And if there's no compliance with that after a series of warnings, that may culminate in removal, which by definition is going to necessitate the involvement of university police and potentially arrest. So it's really not something that we start with. I mean, we want to be highly tolerant of letting people protest, demonstrate. We know that sometimes can involve noise. It can involve some interruption, if not disruption. But when it starts to cross over into it's really impeding the activities that need to happen every day at the university, that's when we need to start thinking about, more severe responses.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that when we worked on when Michelle and I were on the committee in 2016 on University Committee on Disruptive Conduct, one thing we did in meeting with the registered student organizations and students is talk about the sorts of protest and dissent that are completely compliant with all policies and are non-disruptive, and that we would support, that we support and encourage students to engage in, whether it's a silent vigil, whether it's signs that don't block the speaker or otherwise impede the speaker's ability to communicate, whether it's walkouts or students wearing similar clothing to signals. There are a whole range of ways where people suggest their protest and dissatisfaction. And in fact, the report on protest and dissent specifically talks about the university's responsibility to tolerate incidental disruption. Of course, even the best protest and dissent that's consistent with policy will have that consequence. I'll just note that in our work, we also emphasize that while disruptive conduct is a form of speech, it's not a form of protected speech. And so when someone wants to engage in the kind of conduct that Michelle described, they may, like another form of civil disobedience, they may very well do that, but they also would need to embrace the consequences of taking those steps. And there are often good reasons to do that, but it's not one in which we would allow the disruptive conduct and presume that there wouldn't be consequences to one's decisions there.
One of the questions we got, and actually I'll combine two here. So one is from one of the students who was arrested in this incident, which we're referring to, and asks really about values. Is what's going on in the Middle East a sufficient challenge to our values that the administration ought to meet to discuss our complicity through the investment policy? And a related one, do we have a duty in terms of being the University of Chicago to stand up for assaults on free speech, including assaults on universities in Palestine? So I wonder, does anyone want to take on those? I'm staying on the same theme right now.
Well, I'll try. It's a very good question and a very difficult one. And so the Calvin report really has a definition of the university's mission and when it's threatened. And that's when it threatens the discovery, improvement, or dissemination of knowledge, or when it challenges questions of free expression and free inquiry. And that, as you said, then puts an affirmative obligation on the university to act. What's harder is to figure out what are the whole range of activities, whether they're directed necessarily to that or not, that implicate it, and if implicating that is sufficient to trigger the Calvin report. So if there are things going on around the world that impact a whole range of things, including universities, is that general enough and by itself to implicate the Calvin report, or does it need to be directed towards university mission that impacts us on a day-to-day basis and impacts our ability to engage in free inquiry? It's reasonable people can disagree on that. The right metric for measurement isn't entirely clear. But it's just worth noting that there are conflicts around the world that impact, that we don't issue statements about. And one thing that Calvin does is takes us out of the business of figuring out which conflicts are more or less important or which conflicts have more or less impact on the community. And put a value on those as opposed to others. So we can talk about Ecuador, we can talk about Yemen, we can talk about Ethiopia, we can talk about Sudan, we can talk about a number of areas where the university hasn't issued statements and it's impacted journalists, impacted faculty, impacted universities. So it's something to struggle with.
Coming back to this issue about manifestos in the department, which Gabriel referred to before. Now, what about a situation where the chair is not being asked to forward it, but it's going on in the department? And relatedly, when we talk about department consensus, you were saying we have a mechanism for producing consensus. Does that include graduate students or staff?
So when you talk about it going on in a department, you mean is there a conversation happening in which people are trying to come to an agreement about what they should say? I mean, in a way, the way I've just described it, I think that's great. I think that's what we should be doing if there's a sort of robust discussion about what we think. The ultimate goal is to disseminate a statement about what the members of such and such a department think. That's when I would be not happy with it. But that there should be this kind of collective activity, I think that's exactly what we are here for. So I don't, and it will happen on email. That's the way it happens. It'll happen in a Google Doc. That to me all seems just fine. I mean, part of the freedom of speech and conversation is that you will sometimes find yourself on the outs. You will find yourself with a position that isn't the majority position. That's tough. And, but we can't let that be a reason not to stop this kind of conversation. But I'm not sure I've quite got what you have in mind.
We just got a question that's related. So the ability to speak freely and the desire to do so are different things. And we've spent a lot of time talking about the ability and the absence of constraint. But if the broader culture is one where speaking is costly, most people might just decide it's easier to just stay quiet. And is that an issue at the University of Chicago? What can we do to remedy it if it is an issue? And maybe I'll start with you, Gabriel, because it's something I think about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't say that I am the expert on how much of an issue it is at the university, but it is something that I worry about. And this is what I was saying about needing to get clear and articulate the value of taking part in this kind of conversation, which can sometimes be upsetting, because I do sometimes feel that I see students swerving away from the issues. One very common way of swerving away from it is to say, oh, well, this is subjective. And that's not, we're not, as if there's not a kind of a capacity or possibility of reasoned discussion and having better or worse reasons. So I think it is something we should be thinking about, how to build, or maybe a step back. This is where I think the issue of values of diversity and inclusion, where it becomes hard. Everybody can agree that if you're looking for the truth, it's better to have a variety of viewpoints, and that you need to set things up so that people who have traditionally been marginalized feel comfortable expressing those viewpoints. That's when we're aiming for the sort of harmonious discussion. We all can agree that DEI and freedom of expression go together. But the hard thing, I think, is this: not why is DEI supportive of free expression, but why is free expression something that people should value when they feel that they're going to be pilloried in some way or other, or exposed to harm, things that hurt their sense of themselves.
And I was just going to add, I do think that part of the difficulty of answering this question is the different answers you'll get from different constituencies at different moments about how hard or easy it is to enter into a particular discussion. It is a moving target. It's not something that remains consistent across one institution or across even from one year to the next. But I do think, that to the extent that one an institution values a robust discussion, then it is, there's got to be some way. If one thinks about one's activities as a faculty member in the classroom, tracking a discussion and remaining aware of who's speaking, who's not speaking, and doing what one can to bring in those individuals who don't seem to be comfortable engaging, trying to find out what those obstacles are, and recognizing that the solution is going to be imperfect. It's we're at a moment, I think, right, where we can take certain terms and oppose them to other terms and say these things are either harmoniously related or conflictually related. But the reality is that I think it sounds, I guess, like a platitude. Of course, is that it's always a work in progress, and the key is to recognize that we never quite get it. We never quite get it right. But to go back to Gabriel's point, to reiterate the importance of trying to get it right, and that's going to produce the outcomes we want in the end.
We had a general question about transparency. So how does transparency interact with free expression? And apparently we rank low as a university in terms of faculty, according to the questioner, faculty power and governance, as well as transparency related to the endowment. How do you think about that? Maybe I'll turn to Jason. You're as close to the center as
Sure.
Daniel here.
We often hear this, that faculty governance is weaker here or is weak in general, and I'm not sure how to measure that. From where I sit, I see that faculty have enormous authority and autonomy of choice and decision. So faculty decide without interference by chairs or deans what to teach, what books to read, what assignments to set, the standards of evaluation of student work. They also decide entirely on their own what to research, right? That's the kind of academic freedom that we're traditionally thinking about. Those are two massive and central domains to the functioning of any university over which faculty have almost autonomous authority. They also have a lot of authority in other functions, in the third part of their jobs, which we often call service, which is determining not just the policies, but the implementation of aspects of running the university, most crucially, the evaluation of potential colleagues through the hiring process. Departments hire their new colleagues themselves with very little outside interference, as well as make decisions about promotion and tenure, and the admission of graduate students, again, which is almost entirely in the hands of individual departments and run entirely by faculty. So I do understand that faculty don't have governance. They're not in charge of schedules for buses or undergraduate tuition or the staffing of the many offices on campus. I mean, there's a lot of things that the university does that faculty don't actually interact with. But for the core functions of faculty, that is teaching, research, hiring colleagues, evaluating them, and admitting graduate students, it seems to me they have all the power that the university invests in them.
Although, can I respond to that? Because I do think this is a discussion that really goes, in some sense, beyond the purview of this discussion. But as someone who's been on the Council of the University Senate, the Committee of the Council of the University Senate, among the things that I have felt, among the things I hear from my colleague, has been increasingly less faculty control, and this is related to budgetary decisions in terms of this broader setting of university priorities, things that ultimately will have an effect on the size of your graduate cohort and things that are actually important for all in all the domains that you've mentioned, that actually lie beyond faculty control. The setting of agendas, the difficulty of setting the agenda for the Committee of the Council of the University, Senate and the like. These are issues where in other places, or just to throw in another thing, the staffing of committees like the one that I served on as well, whether that is something that's in the entirely in the purview of the administration, whether it should be a more shared responsibility between the administration and faculty. There are a lot of these issues where I think faculty feel sort of structurally shut out, and I think in some ways are structurally shut out from being part of the discussion at the moment where things might, changes actually might occur. But that's, I think, again, it's a larger discussion.
So we got a question about the now over a month-old hearings before Congress, where 3 university presidents were, of course, called up. And the questioner wants to know what you all think of the answers that were given, and how would you have answered the question? So you have to pretend now that I'm Elise Stefanik, and what would you do? Call for genocide of Jews allowed on your campus?
No. I mean, any call to harm, threaten Jewish people, Muslim people, any group, any individual is just plain wrong and would be a gross violation of certainly university policy, quite apart from the moral and ethical issues involved. So that's sort of my simple answer to that question.
Any others?
No, and that seems right. I mean, there's no way that calling for the genocide of any people is a value that this institution or any institution should support. I would have, however, expressed resentment at Stefanik for setting up what is an offensive question. There is no way that anything that was happening at those institutions could be construed as supporting genocide. That was, the question in the venue was indeed simply a setup. Universities have to have a wide latitude. I mean, this is part of the point that we've been making here. One way of judging the latitude that the Chicago principles have allowed us to recall that in the years subsequent to the acceptance of the report on the Committee of Academic Freedom, former late President Zimmer was asked in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, what if a student group invited Richard Spencer, someone who was directly associated with anti-Semitic views, to come to campus to give a talk? His response was he would not, as a president, step in and prevent that from happening. The goal would be to meet hateful views with robust speak. Now, however one feels about that, I do think that was in keeping with the the principles of freedom of expression. In no way could that be construed as saying the University of Chicago supported anti-Semitism or the views of Richard Spencer. And I do think that it would be important to, it would have been important in that instance, as I said, to object to the offensive nature of the inquiry in and of itself, and to say that the universities do have a unique responsibility to take on horrible views with the assumption that the goal is not to support them at all, even to you could say to undermine them and to denounce them, but not to simply presuppose what level of punishment would be visited upon students who had been so accused of making these statements in some respects.
I want to stay on this theme. Oh, did you want to say
I was
something?
say, it seems like that what was so unfortunate, is putting it mildly, about that event is that it seems like, there's a question, is it okay to call for the genocide of the Jews? And the answer to that is clearly no.
Yes. And
And why they did not start with that, I do not understand. But I also, want to have some humility that I wasn't being grilled. But I do feel like that was, there's something really wrong about not being able to say that very clearly and forcefully. But then to take this opportunity next to say, okay, but now look like, this is what we're doing on campus in the kind of way that you're talking about, Ken, as sort of a next step. It's just it's such a shame that it did not happen that way.
Now, I'm synthesizing some of these questions, but I want to stay on this question of the external environment, because it's one that I think is very live for a lot of university leaders. And there was a specific question about Grutter and affirmative action, so I'm going to turn to you, Daniel. So in the Grutter case, Justice O'Connor said that there was a tradition of deference to universities by society in their judgments about who to admit and such. Do you think that the Students for Fair Action case marks a reversal of that? And do you see other signs of less deference, I suppose, from society?
So yes and yes. So I think it's interesting that you're quoting, I think, Associate Justice O'Connor, who is a Reagan appointee, and we see now, I think, a change in the court and also a broader change in society, where I think there's a general skepticism about institutions and increasing polarization in the way that we communicate around the kind of issues that academic institutions, corporate, government are all engaging with. And I think there is a concern, and I don't think it's misplaced, that some institutions have become more partisan, or at least have been experienced as more partisan and are more explicitly so. And I think the court in that particular example, and I think we see in the broader discourse, concerns about universities, and in part it goes to questions about free expression and questions about what ideas are indeed embraced or at least open for discussion in institutions, where others are looking at higher education, looking at universities, and are perhaps worried that the sort of deference that you just described there is not something that we've earned, or at least that we are acting in a way that's, in their view, consistent with the sort of broader educational mission. And to the extent, sadly, that there are incidents like what we just described, which is obviously the testimony referred to, does not help, I think, generally, as we look at institutions as presumably aimed at pursuing knowledge, turning people to become from consumers to producers of knowledge. Rather the concern that we are becoming second-rate political entities. That's something that the Calvin report specifically refers to, and I think that's something that we at the University of Chicago, I think, have been sensitive to, but in higher education is something we have to think about. So is the court channeling that? I mean, I don't know. You can look at the makeup of the court and say they would have arrived at this opinion regardless of what they feel about the role of universities at the moment. But is there a broader conversation in the general discourse? Yes, and it should concern us because we are as strong as our weakest kind of link with in higher education. And we have to be, I think, sensitive to that. And part of our mission with the Chicago Principles and the Calvin Report is to, I think, see other institutions begin to, think differently about their speech environment.
Can I just also am not about that particular case, but I think in terms of the public perception of universities, it says one of the reasons why I do want to keep hammering home on questioning and sort of fruitful, wondering kind of questioning, because when, for understandable reasons, public attention turns to protest, that is coming at a moment in which people are expressing what they already think is true. And I think they often think of faculty members as teaching what they think is true. But the real life of the university is about wondering what is true. And I think that is just, that's something that we need to do a better job of explaining to people, that really that it's about questioning, wondering. Yes, sometimes we take stands, we try out answers. We come to think our answers are good ones. I mean, I don't want to deny that. But the focus on protest does, I think, misrepresent the heart of university, knowledge seeking.
Do we owe anything to students who have expressed opinions and then get punished in some sense by the society? So one phenomenon is doxing. Organizations, as one was named by the questioner, Canary Mission, that are punishing students in some sense for speech that they're undertaking while on campus. Michelle, what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, this is a difficult one, and Canary Mission is a entity that has come up periods of time, and I know it has been quite harmful to students who have found themselves on that site, and there are others like it. And then, of course, there's a whole smorgasbord of terms, doxing being one of them, of ways you can in some ways weaponize social media that just wasn't possible when certainly I was in college, and it's sort of a whole new world for us to grapple with. I think here at the university, last calendar year, efforts were made out of the Office of the Provost to develop some resources for faculty, academic appointees, and students who might find themselves the targets of online harassment, however you want to define it. And it was an attempt to really try to help them on both a practical level, but also on an emotional level in terms of psychological support, and if they're going through this sort of what can be a very, very distressing time, but also bringing to bear any university interventions that might be possible, although they may not always be possible, but certainly to try to showcase what we can do to support people if they find themselves in that situation. One of the things that we learned, in some of the incidents that have happened recently is that, in some cases, sometimes university policies might not have quite caught up with what people are actually capable of doing to one another using social media. And I think this is something that we're thinking very long and hard about, how and to what extent we can make adjustments. But it does get tough because it intersects with free expression. Oftentimes expressing or sharing information online, technically may not be a policy violation, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't cause harm. And that's a tough spot to find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. Do we owe anything to students for protecting students from actions related to the Graduate Student Union. And this questioner is wondering about, do we protect students who feel their speech is constrained or they want to cross the picket line? What do we do to ensure their speech rights, I suppose? I'm going to look at you because I think you've been dealing with this.
Well, I mean, to follow up on Michelle's point, I think it's important for us to reiterate that the university, absolutely stands behind its members' ability to express themselves and to fend off attacks from outside and from inside if need be. The University of Chicago is not one of those places where you're going to lose your job because somebody surreptitiously recorded something you said in class and posted it on TikTok, right? It's not a place that's going to listen to complaints either from inside or especially outside and force students to be expelled or faculty or other academic appointees to resign. These are all things we've seen across this country, and it's never happened here, and it's not going to happen here. And part of the reason, I think, is because we do help students and faculty and everyone in the community understand through this educating mission, through panels like this, to explain our values. We talk about it when people set foot on campus. We do new faculty orientations, new student orientations to help them understand these are our values and you're protected by them. And that goes for students, undergraduates and graduate students who may want to cross picket lines as well. That's their right. Picket lines are not absolute barriers to entry. In fact, legally, they're not permitted to block the entry to buildings, and therefore, and picketers know this, unions know this, they're very well educated. There's usually a picket captain who will help somebody who needs to get to work, who needs to get to a medical appointment, who needs to get to class, or just wants to go through that door. They have the right to do that, and absolutely.
What do we owe students who were punished by the university for campaigns the university later supported? In other words, for successful protests. The examples that are given are the Trauma Center, ethnic studies. Some of these may predate my time here. But is there some, sometimes students protest for something and then we later adopt it. Do we owe anything to the successful protesters? In other words, they've been punished. I suppose it's some sort of reparations kind of theory here.
I'm not actually, the trauma center, not to sound like I'm, passing the buck here, but the trauma center all happened before I was, in my role. So I'm not really familiar with what actually happened in terms of punishment and so on and so forth. I will say generally that it is definitely the case that student activism, student advocacy, however it's manifested, protest demonstrations, regardless of what the disciplinary consequences may or may not be, that kind of action is absolutely, at least in my world, essential for us to improve. And, it may not seem that way to the students at the time, but we're definitely open to their feedback, even if it's highly critical, even if it's loud and noisy and angry. Very often there is an indication baked in there of what we need to be doing differently and better. And so I think as a general principle for people who work with students on the student affairs side, we'd be foolish not to pay attention to what students are agitating around, because there's probably something in there that we need to look at in terms of improving. And I'm not, none of us has got it perfectly right in terms of student life. We need to constantly work on it because our students change and their needs change. So I think regardless of whatever the actual consequences might be from a disciplinary standpoint, we need to pay attention when students are protesting around any issue of the day.
If I could add just quickly, in some ways, I'll use the trauma center as an example. Maybe thank you is in order, and I say that with humility, because it was after that we realized we need to think about what our position is and be more explicit with respect to protest and dissent. We put together the ad hoc committee on protest and dissent. It explicitly talked about the deficiencies in the way that we managed that protest, the communications that need to be improved, and explicitly said, which I think has been a value of the institution over time, but had not been written and under the auspices of a faculty committee, that indeed it's not merely tolerated at this university, that we encourage it. And so in some ways we responded, and I certainly doesn't, put someone who was arrested or otherwise subject to discipline, making them feel better today necessarily. But in our own way, we kind of heard you, we pivoted, and now there's a report that reflects exactly, the values that we think are right, and it's informed by their protests.
Can I add very quickly to that? I would second the idea that we owe them thanks. The university is very responsive to student feedback, including complaints. We have evaluation systems on course and lots of other ways. I'll give one very small, much lower stakes example, that for many years this university did not issue college diplomas that listed both or multiple degrees. So if you double majored, we could only list one. People complained about this incessantly, rightfully so, and we fixed it. So and we never would have known about it. I mean, I wouldn't have known about it, the provost would, unless people complained. They did. We said, that makes no sense. Thank you very much for pointing it out. Let's work to design a new diploma that went into effect last year that can list multiple majors.
We have so many other great questions. There's one more I'm going to ask, and I'm going to answer myself. So the question is, what advice would we give to undergraduates seeking to augment the student body's enthusiasm for free speech? What pitfalls might be out there? All I can say to that is please contact us at the University of Chicago Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression, and we want your ideas for how to do that. It really is your forum. It's all of our forum, and we hope to continue to do this really important work of understanding, practicing, and advancing free expression. Thanks to everyone for joining us.